Welcome to the Union Jews podcast. The UK's only all things union show. Carefully curated for your digital downloadable listening pleasure. Hello and welcome to Union Jews, the UK's only all things union podcast. I'm Simon Sapper. Later, I'm delighted to say that Professor Melanie Simms from the University of Glasgow will be joining us with her regular Thought for the Week. But first, Unions 21. Unions 21 is something unique in the UK trade union landscape. It's a safe space for collaboration between unions and their allies. An action-orientated collaborative think tank is how I like to describe it. And I know I will have met many people listening to this now through the Unions 21 podcast series. So, as Unions 21 hits its 30th birthday, what better than to get a sense of what the future may hold from their executive director, Becky Wright, arguably one of the most influential women and sharpest thinkers in the UK labour movement. Oh, and by the way, full disclosure, I am an unpaid associate of the organisation. Becky Wright, Executive Director of Unions 21. Thank you so much for making time for us to have this chat.
Hi, Simon. Lovely to hear you, see you.
And vice versa. But vice versa. Now, I mean, Unions 21 is 30 years old this year. So are you all out partying? How are you going to celebrate such a momentous landmark?
We've spent the whole year in the pub. We've really enjoyed ourselves. I mean, I suppose it's like any organisation, really. This was a great opportunity for us to reflect and think about the needs of unions, what we wanted to do, where we were going, all of those kind of things, which I really love doing with our unions. And so it's been really fun to reimagine or imagine Unions 21 for the next kind of 30 years. And we're gearing up then for a new strategy and a new start in 2024.
So there are 24 supporter organisations, I think, for Unions 21. The mantra of the organisation, of course, is that it's an inclusive and collaborative space, which is, kind of countercultural for a number of unions in Britain, both historically and to some extent in the present. So, I'm aware that Unions 21 has done a lot of work on, say, union governance. Where's that work stream going, or is it complete?
No, it's continuing. So I think I'm really pleased that you picked up on that one, Simon, because when I went around and asked senior leaders what they wanted from Unions 21, how they felt about Unions 21, and when I talked to people that aren't affiliates of Unions 21, how they kind of saw us, there were a couple of words that came up, which were inclusive, collaborative, and welcoming. And I thought that really reflects the essence of what Unions 21 is as an organisation. It doesn't matter about the size of a union or what sector they're in or what policy positions they have. Everybody comes to the table on their own and is expected to be there for everyone. And governance for us is a huge part of that, in terms of we have our board and the work that our board does to engage with our unions and to think about, what the needs of unions are. But more importantly, what we've been able to do over this year is think about what that means for unions themselves. And we've done some internal work with our affiliate unions around defining governance and looking at what governance means for, I'm going to use the word boards as a catch-all phrase, because I know that some unions call executive committees, ECs, execs, general committees, councils. I mean, there's so many different words. We just wanted to find one that encompassed everything.
Yeah, but that's quite an important conceptual point, isn't it? If you're on a board, that has certain connotations that are different to, say, if you're on an executive committee. And governance is about making sure unions are as best as they can be, but it's not the bright lights and glitz always. It's making sure that, say, the user experience is reliably and consistently high. For example, the money is well spent. There are enough reserves to keep going in hard times and so on. And a board conveys that idea more succinctly, I think. Sorry, we're going off at a tangent. My apologies.
No, so I think the thing is that you're right, that unions tend to see executive committees differently from how people would see company boards, but actually at the end of the day they're the same thing, because both of them have a role to play in the stewardship of the organisation. The idea of making the organisation relevant, visible and solvent, they need to do that. That's the first priority of any board, regardless of whether they're a charity or a trade union or even a business. Stewardship is front and centre, and we've used the term board because so many unions use lots of different terms for it, but fundamentally that's what they're talking about. That's what an EC is. And then from that comes accountability and oversight. So it's that sense of stewarding the ship. Nautilus fans will love my continuous ship metaphors for this, but it's like, you've got to steward the organisation to be the best it can be, and to think through an awful lot of different things, thinking about the future, we talk an awful lot when we're with with boards, around looking forwards and outwards versus inwards and backwards. And
that must be quite challenging for some organisations and some individuals in them.
Yeah, it's actually challenging for everyone. I've just recently stepped down as being on the governing board of my kids' school, and I literally have to write down on a pad before we have every meeting, like forwards and outwards, to remind myself that I don't need to know what colour the textbooks are. I don't even really need to be involved in any discussions around uniform. It's basically how are we going to deal with this particular situation coming, our falling class sizes because we're a London school and all of this kind of stuff, right? That's what I need to be focused on. And it's the same for you. And that's a challenge because it's not something that comes naturally to a lot of people. So it's been a real pleasure to be able to work with some unions to think through that for their exec, and to see, even I still say exec because I've grown up in the trade union world, right? And to think that through and to really kind of help them on that journey to steward their union.
So that's an ongoing work stream.
Yes.
Then, because of course, I suppose it has to be, doesn't it? Because once you get the idea across, once you get kind of acceptance by the individuals who comprise the boards or executives, however you want to describe them, there then needs to be the practical application of the idea. And it can be, I was going to ask you to what extent do you find that unions are still trapped in silo style structures? And or to what extent are we over that hump, what I would see as a hump, and into more fertile territory?
So I think that there's a couple of things that come out of that one. And the first one is that you're right. Once you start a project like this, we thought it was going to be a year talking about member engagement, governance, democracy. And in the end, we realised, once we start the governance stuff, there's no stopping. I mean, we are going to pick up our democracy work, and I'm really excited about some work that we're doing with a Canadian organisation called MASS LBP to reconceptualise democracy and unions. We can talk about that later.
Oh, yes.
But once we started thinking about what it takes to have really good stewardship, we realised that there needed to be more work done to support unions across the piece on this one, and also that no union is unique in needing help, advice and guidance on it. So our affiliate unions will have a governance framework so that they can assess the strength of their governance practices. We're working on that at the moment. We are bringing together governance officers to really kind of help them develop and strengthen their skills and expertise, and to network and understand what's going on in different unions. And we're developing a kind of wider package of support for unions to be able to kind of go through what it is they need to, including a newsletter for presidents and treasurers that gives them up-to-date information on the issues they need to be thinking about in their particular role. And that's not going to be limited to our affiliate unions, because this is an issue that goes across boundaries, across borders, across all of these things. You know, if you are in a union and you take a senior lay position on the board, then we're here to help type stuff.
Right. I mean, you're right. The impact on union democracy is a very key feature. But before we get to that, the point you made about these issues being common across borders.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no reason why peer groups for UK unions can't be based in Canada or France or New Zealand or Sweden, for example.
I mean, this is it, right? Which is increasingly so. You're seeing, you know, the issues that affect unions in the UK are affecting unions across the world. They take different forms and there's different kind of flavors to them, but the issues are still kind of the issues. The issues around governance and democracy and how our unions are run is something that unions across the world could be and should be exploring. It just might be that the governance or the democratic structures are different, but the ideas behind it stay the same. And I think that's one of the things that we've certainly learned with working with different unions across the world, is that understanding the contextual framework for how unions get to the place that they're in and the challenges they have is as important as thinking about what those challenges are. I think when we, you know, back in the day in the UK, when we started talking about organising, for example, I think we took wholesale US models and we just planted them in us. And I think that there is a cultural context and industrial context which makes it work in some instances and doesn't make it work in others. And I see this as well, you know, if you have, for example, a French system, you can't just take one thing, plant it in, and then hope it's going to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of botanical angle on this is quite helpful, because you can't uproot a plant and plonk it down somewhere else, because if the soil type isn't right, if the nutrients aren't right, if the precipitation isn't right, all that sort of context is everything. And I suppose partly context is framed by what we're used to, framed by our history. So I was really interested in the stuff that you and colleagues are doing on user experience design. Taking individual union members and say what's their experience of being a union member, and using the union services. And I wonder, I mean, there's clearly a tension there, because actually, if you pivot yourself to look at the individual UXD, as the acronym is, then that can create tensions or conflict or disturbance between the relationship and those members and, say, the layer of activists you have in a union. And I wonder what the latest thinking is on exploring that, understanding that, trying to get everyone to pull in the same direction.
Our colleague Antti Mäki, who's based in Finland, he does a load of stuff around UXD and UXD, so user experience design for unions as well. And one of the interesting things about listening to Antti talk about this is that he very much comes at it from a position, as I would do as an organizer, which is that we're trying to build the power and influence of the union, right? So this isn't a UXD for better services in the sense of, you know, you'll be able to get your advice and guidance representation quicker. It's about the whole thing, right? And it is also about understanding the relationship between an individual and the collective, and not supposing that the individual will automatically understand the collective and vice versa. So he's very much thinking about, you know, how do you, so I've seen this in terms of member journeys, right? Member journeys and activist journeys. How do you conceptualize people's interactions with the union before they join, as they join, and then after they join, such that it links up to encouraging them to take the next step to be activists. And what I'd say in terms of that tension is that I think that tension is, to what extent would, you know, if we're learning this data about where people are coming from, what's driving them to the union, what they're interested in, what their concerns are, what their fears are, that really should be supporting activists to engage with people better on one-to-one basis and a collective basis as well. And I think the tension comes more when people have preconceived ideas of where their members are coming from or expectations of where their members should be. And I wonder whether it's that difference. Like when I hear unions say we're member led, what does that actually mean?
Well, I mean, obviously, yes, exactly. I mean, there are member-led unions, officer-led unions, but that's perhaps a late 20th century preoccupation that's now slipped by. But I'm just thinking, you know, you look at the toll puddle martyrs, for example, right? And you've got, you know, if that's the basis of union organization, the bedrock of it, or the starting point of it, if you like, you can immediately see how, you know, allowing for technological leaps forward and all the rest of it, you're missing out a whole load of people who don't want to go to meetings, people who aren't from the same demography as that group of members. The importance of understanding what motivates members to join and then to get involved is demonstrated by taking voting in union elections as a very basic measure of union activism. But from that measure, it's clear that we still have significant challenges. Turnout for union general secretaries, union presidents, union executives or boards remains disturbingly low.
Yeah, but and it's across the piece, right? It's not just even in the UK, it's across the piece. And the question is to what extent do people actually connect as individuals that action with themselves? How important do people see those elections? We know from some of the work we've done on democracy that people want to vote for their general secretary. They want to have a direct say in who runs their union. But actually, I think most people aren't as engaged in that process as they could be, you know, and don't necessarily understand it. And this is for unions that directly elect their general secretary, right? There are lots of unions still in the world that don't, that the general secretary is appointed, or it is elected via a conference of delegates and all of this kind of stuff, right? And I think that we have assumed over the years that just because that was how it was set up in the 19th century meant that was like a gold standard of engagement and inclusiveness. And I mean, not everybody, like I speak here now as a white woman, but do you know what I mean? It's like I think we make assumptions that stuff like that, because it's new, will take a whole cadre of people out of the trade union world to some extent. And I don't think that necessarily has to happen. I think it just reimagines like what activists do, how they engage with people. It's more about giving them the tools to do their job, as opposed to having a kind of central to individual relationship, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So when you say to me, like, you're missing out those reps, well, you know, I know that the best reps have great relationships with the people that they work with, because they spend the time and the effort to actually just get to know people, and they're there in people's workplaces, as opposed to being in an office waiting for people to come and talk to them. And I think it might force people to do that a bit more.
The context is crucial, isn't it? The environment in which people operate, in terms of the culture that flows from that. Do you think things like a growth of social partnership, and I was aware of Nisrin Mansour's really good blog about what's happening in Wales in terms of social partnership working. Do you think, say, a growth of social partnership will have a beneficial effect if that growth actually takes place, in terms of people seeing new ways of working and new encouragements to be involved in different ways?
So I thought that Nisrin's piece was really interesting, educational, and also thought provoking, right? Because for those outside of the UK, the idea of social partnership is either the norm or it's to be avoided at all costs,
Yes.
or somewhere in between, right? So look, I'm going to be agnostic about anything like this, because ultimately, at the end of the day, regardless of the system we find ourselves in, we have a responsibility to do the best we can in the situation that we're in. So we could end up having social partnership in the UK where the door is slightly, it's slightly easier for unions to operate in and to do what they need to do. But ultimately, if we're not reflecting the industries and the values of workers, and we have a clear idea of how we're going to kind of tackle membership and collective bargaining wins and all that kind of stuff, then it doesn't matter what system we're in.
Yeah. And actually, talking against my own argument, which I do. Yeah, irrespective of the legal frameworks, when you see workers organising independently and self-organising to protect their interests or to get a better deal, whether it's in New Zealand, Canada, US, France, UK, it's kind of looks pretty similar, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, the thing is that, remember, like in the UK, when we had the Trade Union Act, which put in the levels for taking industrial action, for taking strike action, where you had to have your ballots, and the ballots meant you had to get a certain number of people to turn out and all this kind of stuff. The government of the time did that because it wanted to hamper the union movement's ability to take strike action. And the first ballot that was taken under that was completely jumped over.
Yeah.
And since then, that has continued apace. I mean, there have been ballots where people haven't reached the threshold, and it is time intensive, it is resource intensive, and it is a lot of hard work. And unions that have been able to do that, my absolute hats off to them. But we've still been able to do it. And there's lessons in that. And there's lessons in us thinking through, how can we, if the bar is raised, we're going to have to jump it, whether we like it or not. And if the bar is lowered, let's not lower our expectations as well. Let's also, jump over it, but maybe put a little bit less effort. But with that less effort, what are we going to do instead of, right?
Yeah. I know you've recently been in discussions with the Unions 21 board and the chair, Dave Penman of the FDA. Are you able to share some of the strategic objectives that they're going to be rolling out over the coming weeks and months?
Yeah, so I'm really excited about this now. So if you're a keen Unions 21 follower who listens to Union Dues, I suspect there might be a few of you here. You'll have noticed that our website address has changed recently and our emails have changed recently. So we're no longer .org.uk, but we are .org, and that is to reflect the fact that unions can join us no matter where they are, and we are having unions join us from Ireland and New Zealand. We're getting more interest from unions across Europe, and that's because we're not a trade union centre. We don't report to be, but we are trying to have thought leadership and be somewhere that can support unions to do their work. And so our strategic direction for Unions 21 in the next kind of phase, as it were, is to reflect that. So to really make sure that we're leading on best practice and innovation for unions as they're building for tomorrow, right? As they're thinking of jumping over that bar, they can come to us to get insight. They can come to us to get connections with other unions and other types of interested organisations, and they can get help and support from us and our team to do the work that you want to do. So if you want to do UXD in your union, Auntie can come and help you do UXD from an organising trade union point of view, right? As I said before, when we asked people how they found us in the culture that they thought of us, that sense of being inclusive and collaborative was really important. And so we've also really just put that front and centre and was like, look, we want unions to join us from wherever they are. That's fantastic. we also want unions, though, to realise that we are inclusive. And so we're going to be a broad church, and we're going to have lots of different unions with lots of different views on things. But we're all committed to a common goal in this instance of doing the best we can for members and supporting each other to innovate. And we do that through a whole host of stuff. So what we're trying to do, looking at kind of our work stuff and the things that we're going to be covering. So I mentioned that we're going to be doing stuff and continuing on democracy and governance. So this is all our kind of thought leadership work that we're doing. We're also doing unions using AI. So how do unions themselves use AI to do their everyday kind of operations, and what's the impact of AI going to be on unions themselves? So this is not about negotiating AI agreements at work or workplace trusts and stuff like that on data. That's not what that's about. It's literally like, are you going to be using machine-led learning to write your emails? And what does that mean?
Yeah.
Are you going to be using it to do your strategy? I mean, I haven't this time round, but maybe in the future I will. And we're also going to be doing some stuff around the lessons on industrial action. So what are we learning around strike action and balloting and industrial action, and can we see differences, as you said, from a French approach where the individual has the right to strike to the UK where it's about a collective right to strike. We're going to do more stuff around, we already have quite a lot of work where we encourage people to come together and build connections, and we're going to continue to do all of that kind of work, as well as helping unions to build their capacity. So things around data literacy and training and development, and kind of what we're calling support for unions, where basically if the unions have got a project that they want to work on or take up and they need a bit of a friendly ear or somewhere that they can go to say who's good at doing this, then we're going to help them with that as well. At the end of the day, our view has always been that we're building for tomorrow's unions, so we need to help unions to do that. And listening to our unions, listening to other unions, this was kind of what they felt they needed right now.
But the great thing about having such a wide, diverse supporter base is it's a really kind of deep pool from which to draw people who are prepared to run with these ideas, run pilot exercises, share their experiences with the rest of the group. I just wonder... for you personally, what's next? I mean, I know that in some quarters you're described as an alien with exceptional talent. That's EU regulations for you. But clearly, Union 21 supporters value you hugely. I think every union needs a Becky is something that's gone into common parlance. But so what next for you?
Sleep. I don't know. I mean, I think it's a privilege to work for a trade union and to work for the trade union movement. I always have done, and I always think that's the truth. I think to do this job is a double privilege because you get to have the time, not always the resources, but you have the time to think through how you can help unions and then by extension kind of workers. And I'm really committed to this next phase that we're doing. I think it's one of the more exciting phases. Yeah, I came out of COVID actually really kind of quite not excited. Came out of COVID quite tired, like we all did. But I think there was so much kind of change afoot, and we were able to help so many unions with that. I think it became the catalyst to doing this kind of work, and I'm really pleased. I'm taking more of, I was going to say, a backseat role as all of these different projects kind of kick off. We've got people who will be the point person day to day on them, and I'm going to be the needle that threads everything kind of together. So instead of doing all of our events and all of our training, I'll be doing some of it, not all of it, and that will allow me to kind of sit up and have a helicopter view and to try to think through what we all need to do. And I just have to say, every union has a slightly weird Becky. I say weird, by which I mean someone like me who kind of goes, I there must be a different way of doing this. Can I break it? And I will always remember Paul Novak of the TUC once saying to me, Becky, it's evolution, not revolution. and me going, that sounds boring. Break it and see what happens. But, Paul had a point. I can't break everything all the time. So I'm going to be trying to break things less.
Constructive destabilisation, I think they call it. Becky, lovely to see you and have a chat with you, and very best of luck for the future.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Becky. And I suspect we could have carried on chatting for hours, which would have been fun for us, but not so much for you, listeners, I'm sure. And if you want to find out more about Unions 21, their website is simply unions21.org. Now, listening closely to that was Professor Melanie Simms from the University of Glasgow. And in her Thought for the Week this time round, Mel reflects on some of the key ingredients for union success that Becky and I spoke about. In particular, the importance of knowledge and social partnerships.
It's lovely to be sharing this episode with Becky Wright, who's a longtime friend and colleague, and she raises some really important issues in her interview. One of the things that struck me most is the point about the transfer of practices between countries and between organisations. I was trained as a comparative industrial relations researcher, which meant that I study the similarities and differences between national contexts and the effects on industrial relations. And I'm always surprised by how often union leaders, policymakers and politicians really often don't know very much about how things work in other countries. There are many times when I found myself explaining, for example, that the European Union has a formal remit to strengthen social dialogue. So when the UK exited the EU, we lost a really strong lever to defend and promote structures that facilitate that kind of discussion and negotiation between unions and employers. But we also lost access to a huge range of monitoring services. Until Brexit, I had a role as a scientific advisor to one of the EU agencies that has perhaps the clunkiest title I've ever come across, the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions, but they're known as Eurofound for short. And they're a tripartite agency of the EU that provides knowledge and research to better understand social, employment and work-related policies. The tripartite bit is important. They have representatives of the EU, of employers' associations and of trade unions shaping the focus of their research and publications. And they're an amazing resource for anyone who wants to find out more about how work and employment operate around the EU. Their website's pretty easy to find with a quick Google. Sadly, the UK isn't in the data that they collect anymore, but they publish reports on a huge range of work and social issues. They monitor changes, for example, in the labour force data, how companies restructuring, trends in collective bargaining, developments in the platform economy, and much, much more. And they also publish studies that look at specific sectors and then compare key trends and developments in those sectors in the different member states. So for anyone who wants to find out more about a huge range of industrial relations topics, their website is an absolute goldmine. And if you want to know how industrial relations work in one of the member states, you can go to their website and you'll find sections that describe the basics and link to other sources. I can't recommend it highly enough to anyone who wants to know more about what works in industrial relations in other countries. Meanwhile, researchers in the UK, like me, have lost really valuable sources of data on trends around these important issues. A lot of that data simply isn't being collected in the UK anymore, and that's a real loss, not just for those of us who study these things, but to social partners, to politicians, to policymakers who need information in order to shape effective policies. Essentially, we're all now flying blind on a lot of really important evidence, and that will surely come back to haunt us.
Thanks, Mel. And I think that's a real case of knowledge is power. And a name check next time for the first person to correctly identify who first coined that phrase. A name check too for the idea of social partnership, the idea of employers, unions and a third party, usually government, working collectively. Not a huge amount of it about these days, but where it still exists, on the Health and Safety Executive, at ACAS, the Arbitration and Conciliation Service, and the Low Pay Commission, it really is very, very successful in shaping a shared agenda and delivering tangible outcomes. For example, the Low Pay Commission has always made consensus recommendations to government, and governments of all colours have never so far failed to accept those recommendations. So useful food for thought, I think, and I know some politicians are already metaphorically chewing on that. And a further full disclosure, I am, for a short while longer, a low-pay commissioner. Well, we're just about out of time for this episode. My thanks to Mel, to Becky, and to you, of course, for listening. The companion blog containing links, background signposting to all the things that Mel and Becky and I have talked about during this episode can be found over on the makesyouthink.com website. That's makes-you-think.com. You can contact the show by email, unionjews@makesyouthink.com, where you can follow us and message us on X @JewsUnion. And if you like what you've heard, please do rate, subscribe, like, and share the episode. You can also opt to buy us a virtual coffee by visiting our new Ko-Fi page. That's ko-fi.com/Union Jews. Hope to see you there soon, and many thanks for your support on getting the word out about the podcast. Now, Union Jews is part of the Labour Radio Podcast Network. That's labourradionetwork.org, all one word, and Labour spelt the American way without a U. Now, through that portal, you can access close on 200 Labour and Union-themed radio shows and podcasts, including our own sister show, Union Days, Stories from a Union Scrapbook. Available through the Labour Radio Podcast Network portal or wherever you get your podcasts. Our next episode will drop in a couple of weeks, and I'll be delighted to introduce you to a pair that some have called the Lennon and McCartney of union organising. Yes, it's Henry Fowler and Rob Poole, the creators of Strike Map. Don't miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening. Stay safe and think solutions, not stalemate. Strength and solidarity to all those fighting to defend their terms and conditions. I've been Simon Sapper, and I'll see you next time on Union Jews. Bye for now. You've been listening to the Union Jews podcast. Music by Scott Holmes, a Makes You Think production.